Hey everybody, how you guys doing? I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is a lecture about the ancient Greek philosopher Anaxagoras. He's particularly important before Plato because he talks about nous and or mind and how it shakes things, as already discussed. Please watch the other Greek philosophy videos before this, from Miletus onward, also Egyptians and Babylonians before that, if you'd like. And yeah, let's get into Anaxagoras. So, he was neither Anaximander nor Anaximenes, although we've already had them. No matter how many Annas there are here, none of them named Anna, as already said. He was born in Clazomene, another of the ancient Ionian city-states, in what is today the coast of Turkey, the west coast, like we got out here, that rebelled against Persia together with the help of Athens. Anaxagoras may have fought on the side of the Persians against the independence of Ionia. So he would be something like Benedict Arnold, loyal to the British, decently. Many Greeks did, both loyal and connected to Persia, and those who were merely paid as mercenaries. Think about the 300, and that's all the folks against, of course, Persia. But there were plenty with Persia also, who are connected very much to, in ways, Plato. And Aristotle's connected to Macedonians, who are not so pleasant to Athenians. But there were those interconnected with Persia, like there are those interconnected with Egypt at the time. And after Anaxagoras' considerable property was destroyed, sources say he gave up possessions, good time to do that, and turned to seeking knowledge, philosophy, and wisdom, because he was somewhat the wiser, let's hope. Anaxagoras is said to have been the first to bring philosophy to Athens, when he arrived in 465 BCE, so 500 years before Jesus. Athens was becoming the wealthy center of Greek culture, which was how they were able to support the rebellion of Ionia at the time. So Athens is now coming up in the world. We haven't seen Athens so far in the Greek philosophers, but now we have Anaxagoras coming to Athens, and we're going to have a bunch of Athenians, namely the three most famous, you've probably heard of them, morons, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And all of us are morons, according to Socrates, at least in what seems his original stance. But yes, it would have been in Athens' interest to dominate Greek trade and not give the cut to Persia, very much like the Tea Party. So Anaxagoras taught Pericles, the famed Athenian general, and he was admired by Euripides, the Athenian poet and playwright. Anaxagoras stayed in Athens for 30 years before he returned to Ionia. So many scholars today say that there are a lot of similarities between Anaximenes and Anaxagoras, suggesting Anaxagoras, like the other Annas, is continuing in the Ionian tradition, like the Milesians and like Heraclitus of Ephesus and others. That he was disagreeing and agreeing. He thought the Earth was flat with his cosmology, his physics, and a strong current of air supports the flat Earth, which is an interesting flat earther theory, and that disturbances in the air under the Earth cause earthquakes. Like Thales, who thinks it's disturbances in the water Earth rides on, which is earthquakes, Anaxagoras believed plants have mind, souls, and purpose. Schopenhauer, the German philosopher who influenced Nietzsche and Wittgenstein, two of my favorite modern philosophers, he did believe that crystals are, rather platonically, he did believe that crystals are halfway to plants and they grow intentionally. They're like, ever so slowly. And that shows you the intelligence of and the will of the crystals. Not so much rational intelligence for Schopenhauer, which is human crap, but dog and Buddhistic intelligence will, which we share with animals and crystals, in fact. I come from the hate, so yes, people are sharing their intentions with crystals all the time there. That you have everything is full of gods, according to Thales. Anaxagoras says minds clearly display purpose and intent. Like Pythagoras and Parmenides, Anaxagoras believed that male children are born from the right side of the uterus and females from the left. That is not, I believe, confirmed in modern times. He also theorized that male children come from the right and the left of the male in ways I need not describe, hopefully, which is why they are attached to either side of the uterus, either or, a la Kierkegaard. So yes, Anaxagoras did cosmology. He explained meteorites and eclipses, Plutarch says he predicted the fall of a meteorite in 467. By ancient standards, but by modern standards, impossible. It's not really clear how a lot of the media, they could observe things and know more meteors would fall, which is possible. That they would predict it in a certain year, even then, is in ways some people don't know how they would have even possibly begun to do that. And that is because the events are, I believe, decently random, not that it is that they would not be predictable by any of their means. That he argued, Anaxagoras also argued that the sun was a mass of heated metal, like that worked by a blacksmith. As usual, if you are a physics person, you want to comment on this, that's fine. Please don't call me and everybody just an idiot. But again, I am not completely clear on the cosmologies, on the modern, and we aren't so clear on the ancient, so I would be interested. He said, Anaxagoras said, the moon reflects light of the sun, which is correct, that the moon has mountains, which is correct, and they were inhabited. Incorrect as far as we know, but that early movie with the bat people on the planet, on the moon, not planet. Again, Neil deGrasse Tyson would be pissed. But yes, the sun and stars are masses of stone kicked off of the earth and ablaze by rapid rotation, in line with Pythagorean accounts. Pythagoras would have liked all of this. Strangely, Anaxagoras also argued that egg whites are birds' milk, which he thought was interesting biology physics to explain. Like Socrates, he was charged with impiety. One of the most important things about Anaxagoras is he was also, like Socrates, charged with impiety to the gods because he was theorizing and thinking beyond what he was supposed to. So just like I mentioned, the Greeks are somewhat famous for rather sexual things, but technically you could be put to death for surprisingly easy, silly things that weren't the norm. So it isn't just that the Greeks were free in sexuality at all. Similarly, the Greeks are famous for philosophy, but Socrates and Anaxagoras, some of the first great thinkers of Athens, they were hauled in front of the assembly and during the brief period of Athenian democracy. The only time that Greece was officially, any of Greece, was somewhat democratic, although I guess we can talk egalitarianism and degrees of democracy in all cultures, tribes, and societies. But the period that Athens was democratic, they were condemning the most free thinkers of the one who came into town and the one who followed Socrates, who says at his trial, am I Anaxagoras? No, which tells us that he is worried about being confused with this guy. Both were charged with impiety towards the polytheistic gods for talking a bunch of philosophy and angering up the blood of the youth. So Athens was not, it seems, as accepting a place as Ionia, which was more Persia was more civilization at that time and part of Persia and Babylon and all of that. That Athens was more out in the sticks. I'm out here in California. We're now known for plenty of the internet and other stuff. Of course, it's also out here in the sticks, a little free. And that is Athens and Ionia and all of that by degrees and arrangements, of course, here. In different ways, it seems. So, saying the sun was a rock on fire is apparently possibly heresy against Apollo. And in Plato's Apology, Plato's account of Socrates' trial, which isn't an apology, it's his explanation. We use the word as explaining why I'm wrong. Socrates is just using an explanation, which is an apology. Let me explain why I'm right. Socrates is asked by the prosecution whether or not he thinks the sun is stone and the moon is earth, without punctuation in the original, which makes it confusing unless they parse it with modern punctuation. And Socrates responds by wondering if he is being confused with Anaxagoras. You telling me I think the moon, the gods aren't real and stuff's just rocks on fire? What are you, crazy? I'm not Anaxagoras. Get a load of this guy or that guy. But don't, Socrates says neither the jury nor his young students are stupid enough to believe that he would hold such absurd views, which the last thing Socrates says is, go kill a rooster for Asclepius, please, for me. So he does officially perform polytheistic animal sacrifices, or request it, not perform it, as his final act. And he does say in his trial, am I not believing in the polytheistic gods? I mean, come on. I'm thinking that stuff's just rocks on fire? Give me a break. He says this quite clearly. And he's being tricky throughout the whole trial and making fun of how stupid he thinks we all are with our thinking. So perhaps he is saying, am I Anaxagoras? No, I'm not. But he does mean, well, I am very much like him. But at the same time, he does officially say he's specific. Well, Plato says as him, that, yeah, I'm not Anaxagoras, thanks. Even though Plato himself is a bit Anaxagoras and tries to be, as we'll get into here. So, the Athenian assembly has Anaxagoras' impiety in mind as they prosecute Socrates for the exact same thing, and Socrates mentions this to them knowing that. Socrates was not primarily concerned with cosmology. As mentioned, a lot of the Milesians and then Anaxagoras and early philosophers, even Heraclitus, is into fire and water. They're very into fire, water, earth, air, which Plato and Aristotle also are. It gets into more ethical and wisdom matters, where how do we live life increasingly, and it is as it moves into Athens, where you have Anaxagoras saying both cosmological things and very Pythagorean things, and then saying, but also it is the life, as the Pythagoreans thought, with their rules and wisdom sayings. So Socrates more turns to what is the good life, and he doesn't sound so cosmological as much as Anaxagoras, but he does sound a lot like Anaxagoras in many ways, as does Plato. Anaxagoras was put on trial in Athens. According to some, Pericles spoke in his defense, and Pericles is one of the only guys we have recorded as a general who is saying anything during the democratic period of Athens, in print, in text of any kind. But Anaxagoras was still sentenced to death, after which Pericles helped him to flee to Lampsacus, Gesundheit, in northern Ionia. According to others, Pericles sent Anaxagoras that place, before he could be put on trial, as Pericles was himself losing favor in Athens at the time. Either way, Anaxagoras left Athens with the help of Pericles to continue his work until his death there 10 years later. Famously, Socrates does not do this. Socrates chooses to stay and die. And we know this. Anaxagoras fled with the help of wealthy people, and he went and set up shop elsewhere, which I wouldn't necessarily is not fine, and we will have Critias trying to convince Socrates of that in a little bit. So Socrates clearly in context here says, I'm not an Anaxagoras, and then he also, whether or not he is like him philosophically, it's like, and I'm not an Anaxagoras, I'm going to stay here and get executed. Thanks, I'm not going to pay. The rich guys can buy off the guards, of course, just like Anaxagoras. I'm not going to do that. And that's confusing, actually. That is some of Plato's confusing work, where Socrates seems to go back on himself to convince us he needs to stay and die, and in ways that many don't find entirely convincing. But he is clearly telling us he's not Anaxagoras and going to go set up shop elsewhere. He says this, actually, because he says he has a special allegiance to Athens, and he was born there, and so he must die there, and he needs to be there. Let me show you the dance of my people. Anaxagoras is from out of town, so he leaves again. And I gotta say, I don't think he has the same argument Socrates does. He wasn't born and raised in Athens, so what reason would he like Socrates to stay? But Socrates doesn't pose himself off against Anaxagoras like that. So only fragments. Let's get to Anaxagoras' philosophy. That was a bit of bio, of course. So what are his views, Anaxagoras's, given he's somewhat similar to Socrates but not? So only fragments survive, which sounds familiar. The pre-Socratics are only fragments in the works of others, and here and there. Diogenes Laertius, who we hear from constantly, a Greco-Latin guy, says that Anaxagoras composed one short work which could be purchased for 1 drachma. Socrates in Plato's Apology says the youth would not come to him for answers if he held the foolish views of Anaxagoras, because they can purchase those ideas for a single drachma. You can get those for $1 at the market. According to Anaxagoras, the cosmos has always existed, but originally it consisted of tiny fragments of elements mixed up. Sounds like a bunch of others. Even as everything separated, each thing contained traces of everything else, which is how transformation is possible. Anaxagoras wrote, all things are in everything. This gets into very interesting position physically, because he is going to say there's hoarseness in salt and in everything, which is weird. Originally, everything was a homogeneous mass, all the same mixed up chaos, very much like the primordial ocean. And out of this, things developed into what they are while still containing traces of every other thing. Anaxagoras noted, if food becomes various parts of animals and humans, if a horse eats hay and the hay has protein and that becomes horse, it becomes skin, bone, and hair and muscle. Food, as well as matter in general, must already be these other things. Now, so oddly, of course, what we would say with modern biological understandings is there's protein in hay, you can't just eat dirt. I saw something on Reddit yesterday which said, cut out the middleman, eat dirt, become an eternal pure being. And it's like, yes, I don't think that works though. Because of course you have to develop protein, and then the proteins turn into the horse and the hair and the bone and the muscle and ours. So technically there isn't humanness. There is sort of. Of course, you could say, well, yes, there's some proteins all mixed up. Incomplete and or incomplete proteins. You know, you can watch more YouTube on all of people about that. That basically, yeah, you can get proteins and you can become more a horse or more a human. That doesn't actually mean technically there's human and horse and a bit of hair in protein itself and in food and in hay, but sort of. But he is more suggesting that all of the properties of horses exist in hay, which is how hay can become horses. Hay is for horses, as kids used to say on the playground in my day back then. So there are seeds of things, spermata, he says, a familiar, strange, disturbing word, a little discouraging, of humans, animals, and plants, but that they're undeveloped. So there's just the mixed seeds of everything and everything. It's almost Jane, but not. And then you have all these seeds all mixed up in everything, because the Janes would be less dividey, all several seeds. And then you have it all sort of become mixed up as the horses and people and plants. This is how he gets over the Eleatics and Parmenides, is because the atoms and the stuff is always there. But he has a weird stuff that's sort of all the different seeds, but then it also is kind of homogeneous and not the little fire atoms and water atoms. Many atomists would say there's little fire atoms that have forever been fire atoms. They've never changed, which is how that works. So oddly enough, Anaxagoras is actually not being completely Parmenidean or Eleatic here, because he's saying actually fire-waterness is all in primordial stuff energy, which has all the seeds of fire, water, horseness in it. Which is not there are separate fire atoms, water atoms, or horse atoms. Kannada of India possibly thought there's mind atoms, self atoms, fire atoms, water atoms, and then those combine to have self-consciousness, fire, water. And Anaxagoras is actually would not be like atomist like Kannada, nor the Eleatics. He thinks that it's all stuffness. It's a little more Anaximander, which is his infinite, the apeiron. So through the process, fire just becomes more fiery than everything else, but everything is somewhat fiery, and everything is somewhat watery, and everything is somewhat horsey. You know, horsey, yes. So everything rides the horsey, and thus is horsey. So Anaxagoras is a little like Melissus, the last Parmenidean, the last Eleatic. That's also not a band name, and shouldn't be. So, yes. Anaxagoras says, most and centrally, a lot of these philosophers of Greece are very important for very particular ideas, because those particular ideas became enshrined in later philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. And one of these ideas is Anaxagoras using the word nous, or mind. Now with Xenophanes, there already is something that shakes everything with its mind, and Anaxagoras seems to be thinking of Xenophanes a bit here. Anaxagoras says the cosmos is ordered by mind, nous, in the Greek. Anybody who's done a bit of Plato knows that there's a sorts of totem pole that Plato likes to get into, which are rather Trinitarian, and he likes to put mind and nous at the top as the sort of primordial one, and it gets into a lot of interesting stuff we'll get to with the Timaeus, which is in the Republic, but gets into its whole thing and cosmological in the Timaeus, in which vegetation is like the hair of the world, which is probably what Anaxagoras equally and Pythagoras would have thought. So mind separates the like from the unlike. So let there be light, let there be darkness in Genesis, and then mind separates things into their differences. Like a child ordering blocks, like a human being sifting grain from and the wheat from the chaff and separating things into containers in farms or in shops increasingly. So Anaxagoras, it is God above the chaotic waters in the beginning of Genesis a bit, where there's God and there's the waters. And why are there two things, which biblical Old Testament's Torah scholars have mentioned? Well, there's two things, interestingly. Why are there two? Maybe that's one, maybe it's language. Anaxagoras noted mind clearly rules animals and humans, the higher and more developed forms of life. Wittgenstein says, how would we say a dog thinks? And we'd say a dog thinks insofar as it behaves like a human being thinking, and that could be several different things. Let's not get into it right here. Mind is in some things, such as plants and bears and humans and dogs for Wittgenstein, but not in others, while it still directs the process of all things, including rocks and sand. Anaxagoras uses the metaphor of human beings who carry inanimate objects such as honey and milk and lead lower animals such as cows in the direction we wish them to go. Notice that would be like your bones and your brain being led by something like mind above all of that and in all of that, which is where this gets confusing. And a lot of Plato and Aristotle could be said to try to work out Xenophanes and Anaxagoras' problem here, which is if you have pure mind over the chaotic waters and it interacts with them, what are the mechanisms by which perfection itself interacts with something quite different, and why would the quite different and sin and problem exist in the first place? Those sorts of things are philosophical and theological, and I would say if you think all that's antiquated or mythological as a human being, I don't think so at all. I think these are very psychological, one could say. Psychological and historical, as Sloga would say, that these are problems human beings encounter with thinking about science, politics today, as Nietzsche would say, politics in the modern nation state, rather than polytheism and monotheism. I like to argue for that, and I do distinctly argue that these are not old problems. These are problems you can find in human thought. It's best to look at it when it's polytheism or anything that you're not, because then you can see how human beings behave, and it's not you, which makes it exceptional time to learn about all of that. People can screw up and it's not you, and that's fun, when it's not specifically you screwing up in front of other people, when it's other people screwing up in front of you, So, yes, you can see the bones and the brain are led by the mind, which is the honey and the milk, the material like the bones, and then the cow is like the human mind, and then that's led by the higher mind like the human being. So the human being is like nous, the cow is like the human being, and the cow's bones is like the rocks and the sand and the milk and the honey, which is technically, I suppose, here not alive. Seems to be, Anaxagoras seems to say, and let's leave it at that, because I don't know enough to get into that. So like Xenophanes, it does not seem to be affected by things, but knows all things and moves all things. So we have here monotheistically mind itself. Think about polytheism transitioning to monotheism, and the New Testament is written in Greek. We don't have an Aramaic New Testament. We have a New Testament and stories of Jesus written in Greek, with Jesus making a lot of interesting things and puns in Greek, which is brilliant of Jesus to do here. So it seems affected by all things. It's a mind that knows all things and is all things, but also is separate from all things. I do love getting into, it's too pantheistic to be Heraclitus and think mind is all things, as all things, like this is God right here. God is separate and above as a king or an authority, but also pervasive throughout all things in monotheism. This is very much that. It knows all things, it shakes all things, like Xenophanes says, but it's above all things too. Where's the connection here? How does the connection happen if it is and moves everything, but also is unmoved and perfect and eternal and objective? If you have anything in science that's eternal and unmoving, how does it move all the things? Would be another way of... If you only see things that are moving, how is gravity static in the slightest? Or how is being static in the slightest, or numbers static in the slightest, if all things move? If all things are full of gods, where do the gods come from here? Where are the ideals and the static in the moving? These are modern problems, and they are perhaps perpetual, a la Aldous Huxley. Perhaps these are psychosocial, historical, psychological problems. That's the way that I choose to look at it. Mind alone, thus, Anaxagoras says, is self-ruled, very much as a monotheist would say. So only God knows. Everybody else knows somewhat and doesn't know what they know, which is very Islamic mysticism and others. So Plato was very influenced by Heraclitus' Logos, which he seems to stack on the bottom, and then he seems to be stacking somewhat Pythagoras and Parmenides and Anaxagoras up near the top and trying to wrestle with their ideas above the watery chaos of Heraclitus and the Buddha, whom Plato would not have known of. That you would have something like subjectivity down below as watery chaos, and then there's some kind of objectivity, but how would objectivity, static and pure and good, interact with mixed up some and some subjectivity? This is a frame I love to teach from. It is very basic Hegel, decently, And Hegel sees it a lot in the Greeks and thinks the Indians and the Chinese, well, he thinks the Indians didn't do much. Buddha started at zero, stayed at zero, and he doesn't know much about China. It's unfortunate because you can see a lot of the same frames in China and India, and I love talking about Greek philosophy and arguing about it because you can see these positions of subjective, objective. Well, how would objective be subjective then? If all the colors I've seen with my eyes, what do I know of objective colors statically? Problems like that and getting into it would be taking similar positions, anticipating certain moves by other human beings given sources of evidence like eyes, ears, texts. So we can see how human beings wrestle with the best of thought in India, Greece, China. Babylon and Egypt somewhat, we've lost a lot before that. But these are positions which I think you can find in theology and polytheism and monotheism. Whether or not you are religious, I am not a religious person. I do think that people should engage in all these positions if they want to. Not going to force anybody, of course. What's that? But most people don't take philosophy. In France, they require you to take a philosophy class as a senior. In America, they don't. But that's all right. People can, take classes, hopefully. Again, but if you don't want to pay for that, you got YouTube a bit. So anyhows, let's keep it going with the YouTube then. So you definitely see here, though, in sub-rant routine ending, that you have a pure mind, very monotheistically, waters of chaos down below, and Plato is trying to figure out how Anaxagoras is right with mind and nous, how Pythagoras is right with numbers and ratios, and how Parmenides is weirdly right that nothing really moves and all is mystically one without difference, which everybody kind of says, including Heraclitus down below with the waters, but is weird. And how does subjectivity and objectivity fit together? Which is what you find the Indians and Chinese and others wrestling with very much as they're wrestling with human beings, arguing about everything and practices and authority and how to have the best society when things somewhat fall apart, particularly in periods like that, which Athens is in a period of ascendancy, and then as Socrates is coming about is in a period of decline, and they are worried about all of this because of things Anaxagoras has been experiencing over in what is today modern Turkey before. So mind rotated the chaotic mixture, just as sun and celestial bodies move in circles, and the process of life and the elements work in cycles on Earth. Things gradually were separated out into what they are today, not sharply or immediately divided. It follows Anaximenes in condensation and dissipation. They were separated first by cold mist from warm ether. Notice this is again Milesian and very cosmological. There was a primordial cold mixture of water and earth, and that separated from hot air and fire. You have hot, cold, wet, and dry, earth, air, water, and fire, and then those fitting together in a kind of periodic table of sorts the ancient world was decently into, sometimes as a totem pole, sometimes as more of a square, and you find this with many a folk. The cold separates into water, earth, and stone, and then things mix up into warm clay, which then spawns plants, animals, and humans. This isn't terribly wrong. From warm clay, etc. There's a couple of steps here according to modern stuff. Modern biology, of course. Anaxagoras was criticized Empedocles for saying there are four root substances: fire, water, earth, and air. We see that he thinks there's something all mixed up, which is hair and horses, and isn't just fire, air, earth, and water, which is far more common in the ancient world. Plato and Aristotle adopt Empedocles very much, say there's fire, air, earth, water, and Heraclitus was already talking that way. Anaxagoras thinks actually there's just stuff, and fire, water, horseness is all kind of equiprimordial, and that yes, he says that things are not split apart with an axe, which is a good thought. I like this thought of his. If you do believe that things are relative, you would often say there are no absolute categorical differences between things, and that there are always shades of gray, which is a common skeptical, relative, subjective position in human affairs. And so you could quote Anaxagoras thus and say if there are shades of gray, things are not split with an axe, meaning in reality, that things are not absolutely cleaved apart. Perhaps say we have great gender bifurcation. Gender sexuality bifurcated is 1 billion years old, but there are also shades of gray. So we try to split apart something with an axe, we can't. So there are shades of gray in something that highly bifurcates, is the way I like to go about teaching about gender, which I do have to do, because I am somewhat gendered. Yes, I guess we all are. But supposing here, again, that things are not absolutely categorical, they are somewhat interrelated. Of course, with Anaxagoras, most kind of primordial soup-wise in the stuff. So he argues Empedocles is wrong. There are no primary or secondary substances. There's just being, one primary thing. All other substances are secondary, like energy, something like that. And then people would think of electricity rather than fire, as I like to explain with Heraclitus, because they use fire, they use electricity, but energy's water, your great Aunt Judith, everybody. So, and everything. All things full of gods, and your great Aunt Judith. So it is the first element that emerged from the whole, that air and ether emerge, but ether is not the primary element. It is just for him a sticky element, again, that is sort of primordial air energy something, which then is sort of in a lot of stuff, I suppose, very much. He also says, somewhat like Zeno, things are infinitely divisible, which means he's not actually an atomist, because an atomist says you divide things down and then you get fire and water atoms, you can't divide them further. He says, no, you can divide it and divide it and divide it and divide it and divide it, which is more our modern instincts, I think, after the quark, that and atoms should no longer be called atoms without cut anymore. He considers a grain of rice, and he says there's no limit to cutting the grain into pieces. And Zeno found this to be a paradox. He just says, no, the infinite regress is a matter of fact. The big problem, however, here is, and this is the final thought here we will finish up and close out on here, and mention Aristotle and his views on this, is that Anaxagoras says that things are separated into many substances and move around, but they are very much shaken and split into things by something which itself is never split with an axe and something which truly deep down is never different. So how does all this work? And Anaxagoras says mind guides everything, it directs this, it directs that, and that's mystically what it is. How do we know? He doesn't say it's mystical, but he sort of just pops mind in there. We still use the expression Deus Ex Machina as the God spirit in the machine, a la Ghost in the Shell of the Japanese anime. Which I watched a long time ago, and some of the first anime I ever saw. The expression is usually used as a criticism, that just dumping in something at the end of a plot in order to solve a plot hole. And some accused Anaxagoras of using mind like a plot hole device, where it's just lowering a god or goddess into frame and having them be like, all is forgiven, the man and woman are no longer in peril, and everyone celebrates at the end of the terrible play with a horrible plot twist. The Roman Horace gives the Latin phrase Deus Ex Machina, which is not Greek, and says Greek actors, because he's familiar with Greek theater, and hopefully Egyptian theater as well, portraying gods in the tragedies were lowered onto stage when required, and sort of God did it, people know that. I do think, in a certain sense, while science also can serve as a Deus Ex Machina, you should trust vaccines, you should not trust people just saying science will solve problems. Yes, we have to proactively pay attention to how much we're doing helicopters or not, regardless of how well vaccines work, and then we don't feed and house people. So, in certain ways, just saying science solves problems, yes. That's not good enough, though, on a particular thing. I don't like it when people at the end say, reason, logic, science. That'll solve things. It's like that's been here since Sumer and Egypt. I really don't like that. I like particular examples. I don't like flights towards words like logic and reason and science, rather than concrete examples and argumentation. I don't think that's as logical. But people say this is logical, that is not thinking. And so they're, similar for me, Deus Ex Machina, because I'm not I'm not lowering polytheistic gods into things to explain things. I have to deal with people who just say stuff's reason and then don't think all that out. So, we're all dealing with our Deus Ex Machinas in our own machinations, given our own mechanics and how surly we all are. So, yes, Aristotle argues that Anaxagoras puts mind in as a final afterthought. Some say the same of Descartes. I think, therefore I am, ta-da, now there's thinking. Nietzsche says Descartes sort of smuggles in thought rather than I'm aware, therefore I think, and there's conscious thought like 2 + 3 = 5. Nietzsche says he kind of smuggles in concepts in with the awareness. There is, Anaxagoras just spots, mind does it. That's how nothing is different. But then there's different things like salt and horses and stuff. Yeah, that was just mind separated it out. But mind is inseparable in itself. Great. What? Okay. And notice this is very much monotheism explaining polytheism but having its own problems, is what I would say very simply. With similar human brains and problems in society, politics, psychology, and history. The British philosopher, early computer scientist Alan Turing says machines can be said to understand things. So if a robot behaves like a person, we may treat it like a person. But that also is a problem. That people sort of pop in mind, and they attempt to get rid of hard dualism of Anaxagoras and Descartes, but the opposite attempt to simply say anything that kind of behaves in a certain way is simply conscious also has problems the other way. The Euripides is a great admirer and possible student of Anaxagoras. He was ridiculed by his critics for often employing the device of a god-lowering crane, particularly to end a play with resolution. Often women who have tragically accepted their fate, which makes them a very noble woman, very much a major character in a David Lynch movie, are taken away by a god to safety all of a sudden because they proved their virtue. And then, yes, they are then taken away for being virtuous enough by the end of the plot so safely in the American cookie-cutter movie. Aristophanes, another famed playwright, mocked Euripides for making Euripides himself a character in one of Aristophanes' plays, and he lowered Euripides himself into a scene on a crane to be so meta with Euripides. Aristotle criticized Euripides for overusing the device and said plots should resolve due to their internal elements, I believe in his Poetics, and not by an external element in the end. So it parallels his criticism of Anaxagoras. Aristotle says, who also places a pure mind atop the whole, to explain it without giving an account in terms of the elements, which means that Aristotle knows, of course, he is criticizing Anaxagoras and Euripides in a similar manner who are similar interrelated familial people. Aristotle does believe very much in a teleological universe. Many people weirdly would say the Greeks and Aristotle, they weren't really serious about religion or spirituality. They were really serious about science, which those words don't make a lot of sense regardless of how religious you are or not, historically or psychologically, because in many ways, these folks did believe, like Aristotle, that purpose is what directs things. So Aristotle and Aristotelianism, insofar as it is awesome at all, is very much parsing out forms of gods, intents, minds, stuff of nous, and forms of nous, which are the purposes of bananas and people and your intent to go outside today. He is very much arguing in terms of purposes and how things have purposes, like Thales says all things are full of gods, and Anaxagoras crowns everything with nous and intent, with Xenophanes shaking. Xenophanes doesn't shake all things anymore, but that nous and something like that, intent and apeiron-ish, is moving and shaking all things as its spirit, mind, self, as consciousness, as a human-like consciousness. So Aristotle does believe in a human-like consciousness that is teleological, which is a word that means intentional design, effectively. Aristotle believes in intelligent design. Conscious design, let's call it. But mind and purpose are physically involved in the process, not separate above. Aristotle criticized Anaxagoras bringing mind into the picture as the driving force and then failing to describe it further. That mind has a plan, and Aristotle says, yes, but what's the plan, man? And Aristotle's physics and Plato. You can see a lot of Plato and Aristotle as trying to say, well, we don't believe Heraclitus and all a bunch of Buddhism. Everything isn't somewhat subjective down below some and some. Things are objective and rational and logical and pure and mathematical, but how does that happen? Well, nous makes Pythagoras and Pythagorean math happen cosmically, which is very Pythagorean, that it's all some intent of a one thing, oneness. But where does that come from and how? And a lot of the work of Plato and Aristotle could be said to be working out how nous works into the Heraclitus, which is very much Plato's cave, which is sort of ascending rather than descending here. Well, ascending to the oneness, of course. And yeah, a lot of Aristotle and Plato is already set out in the Greek philosophy lectures that we've already had, which brings us all the way up to Anaxagoras. We're going to have another thinker or two and a lecture or two on Socrates, probably one, along with Plato, and then we will be getting into Plato and Aristotle, which is why this is a very good lecture to watch before getting into Plato or Aristotle at all and the lectures on that, because it will certainly be incorporating a lot of this. I will be bringing up that just as I've been bringing up Pythagoras and Xenophanes and others. All right, so that's excellent. Have a great day, and hope you guys, again, shake all things with your mind, and much happiness.